The phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the kitchen counter as my mother's voice echoed through the speaker. "We sold the apartment, Ellie. It's done." My heart stopped, the world tilting as I stared at the cracked linoleum floor of my tiny rental, the one I'd been scraping by in to save for a future I thought was secure. I was 30, single, and had spent the last 5 years pouring every spare cent into that apartment. A cozy, sunlit haven in Brooklyn I'd bought with my own sweat and tears. It was my first real achievement, a symbol of independence after a childhood of instability, of moving from one cramped rental to another because my parents couldn't manage money. They'd always leaned on me, their only child, to fix their messes, but this, selling my home without a word, it was betrayal carved into my bones. I grabbed my keys and drove to their house in Queens, the 40-minute ride a blur of rage and disbelief. The deed to that apartment was in my name. I'd made sure of it, double-checked every document when I bought it, because I knew my parents' history of reckless decisions. How could they sell it? And why? The questions burned as I pulled into their driveway. The same peeling paint bungalow I'd grown up in, now looking smaller, sadder, under the gray autumn sky. My mother opened the door, her face a mask of forced calm. "Ellie, you're overreacting," she said before I could speak, her voice syrupy with that fake innocence she'd perfected over decades. My father stood behind her, arms crossed, avoiding my eyes. "We needed the money," she continued, stepping aside to let me in. "You weren't using the place. It was just sitting there." Sitting there. My voice cracked, loud enough to make her flinch. "It was mine. I paid for it. Every mortgage payment, every repair me." I was shaking, my hands balled into fists. The living room smelled of stale coffee and regret. The same faded floral couch sagging in the corner where I'd spent countless nights as a kid, listening to their arguments over bills they couldn't pay. My father finally spoke, his voice gruff. "We had no choice, Ellie. The business went under. We were drowning in debt." He ran a hand through his thinning gray hair, looking older than his 60 years. Their catering company, their dream, had been a black hole for years, sucking up their savings and mine whenever I was guilted into helping. But this wasn't a loan or a favor, this was theft. "How did you even do it?" I demanded, my pulse hammering. "The deed's in my name." My mother hesitated, her eyes darting to my father. "We found a buyer, a developer. They didn't ask too many questions." Her words were a confession, slippery and vague, but they hit like a punch. Forgery. They'd forged my signature, my identity, to sell what wasn't theirs. I wanted to scream, to tear the house apart, but something colder took over. I'd spent my life cleaning up their messes, bailing them out, believing their promises that they'd change. Not this time. "Where's the money?" I asked, my voice steady now, dangerous. They exchanged a glance, and I knew. They'd already spent it. "It's gone," my father admitted, his shoulders slumping. "We paid off the loans, the suppliers. There's nothing left. Nothing left. My home, my safety net, gone to cover their mistakes." I turned and walked out, ignoring my mother's pleas to talk this out. In my car, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened, my mind racing. They thought they'd won, that I'd crumble like always. They didn't know I'd kept the real deed, locked in a safe deposit box, a precaution I'd taken years ago when their borrowing got too close to my finances. They'd sold a lie, and I was going to make them pay. I drove to my bank, the safe deposit key burning a hole in my pocket. The deed was there, crisp and untouchable, my name in bold black ink. I clutched it, my lifeline, and called my lawyer, Sarah, a friend from college who'd always warned me about my parents' recklessness. "Ellie, this is fraud," she said, her voice sharp over the phone. "We can fight this, but it's going to get ugly." "I don't care," I said. "I want my apartment back, and I want them to face consequences." Sarah laid out the plan. File a police report for fraud, sue the buyer for purchasing stolen property, and freeze any remaining assets my parents had. It was a war I hadn't wanted, but they'd left me no choice. As I hung up, I felt a strange calm. For the first time, I wasn't their daughter, their fixer. I was Ellie Harper, and I was done being their victim. That night, I sat in my rental, the deed on the table, its edges glowing under the dim lamp. I thought of the apartment, its creaky hardwood floors, the bay window where I'd read on rainy days, the life I'd built there. It wasn't just a place. It was proof I was more than their mistakes. I'd fight for it, not just for me, but for every time I'd let them take a piece of me. This was my line in the sand. The next morning, I met Sarah at her office, a sleek Manhattan space that smelled of coffee and ambition. She slid a stack of papers across her desk, her eyes steady. "This is serious, Ellie. Your parents committed a crime. If we push forward, they could face jail time." Her words hung heavy, and I felt a pang of guilt, sharp and fleeting. They were my parents, flawed but familiar, the ones who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd cheered at my graduation. But they'd also lied, stolen, and left me to drown in their chaos. "I know," I said, my voice quieter than I meant. "But they didn't give me a choice." Sarah nodded, jotting notes. She'd already pulled records. The sale had gone through a shady developer, Pinnacle Properties, known for quick cash deals and cutting corners. The contract listed me as the seller, my signature scrawled in a hand that wasn't mine. Seeing it made my stomach twist. My mother's looping cursive, unmistakable. We filed the police report that afternoon. The officer, a tired-looking man named Rodriguez, raised an eyebrow when I explained the situation. "Your own parents?" he asked, not unkindly. I nodded, my throat tight. He took the deed, examined it, and promised to investigate. "This is fraud, plain and simple," he said. "But family cases? They're messy." Messy didn't begin to cover it. By evening, my phone was buzzing with texts from my mother. "Ellie, please, let's talk. You don't understand. We're family." I ignored them, but each message chipped away at my resolve. I wanted to hate them, but part of me still ached for the parents I'd once believed in, the ones who'd promised me the world before they started taking it away. Sarah's next move was to send a cease and desist letter to Pinnacle Properties, demanding they halt any plans for the apartment. The buyer, a faceless LLC, had paid $800,000, below market value, a red flag that they'd known something was off. "They'll fight back," Sarah warned. "They've got money and lawyers. But we've got the deed, and that's ironclad." I spent the next few days in a haze, working my barista job to keep my mind off the chaos. My coworkers noticed my distraction. Lila, my manager, slipped me an extra coffee and asked if I was okay. I gave her a weak smile, unable to explain that my life was unraveling. At night, I pored over legal documents, trying to understand the battle ahead. The apartment wasn't just a loss. It was a violation, a theft of my trust. Then came the call from my father. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. "Ellie," he said, his voice raw, "we didn't mean to hurt you. We thought you'd be fine. You always are." His words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I'd always been fine, always picked up the pieces. But not this time. "You thought wrong," I said, and hung up. I didn't owe them explanations. I owed myself justice. Sarah called with an update. Pinnacle had responded, claiming they'd bought the apartment in good faith. They were countersuing, arguing I'd failed to disclose the sale. It was a lie, but a clever one. They were banking on my parents' forged documents holding up. Sarah wasn't fazed. "We'll depose them," she said. "And your parents. They'll have to testify under oath." The thought of facing my parents in court made my chest tighten. I imagined their faces, the guilt they'd try to hide, the excuses they'd spin. But I also imagined my apartment, the life I'd built, the future they'd tried to steal. I nodded to myself, alone in my rental, the deed still on my table like a talisman. This wasn't just about winning, it was about reclaiming what was mine. By the end of the week, the police had opened an investigation into the forgery. Rodriguez called to say they'd found evidence. A notary public who admitted to signing off on the sale without verifying my identity. My parents had paid her off. A desperate move that was now unraveling. I should have felt triumphant, but all I felt was hollow. They'd gambled my future and lost, but I was the one paying the emotional price. I went to bed that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how it had come to this. My parents weren't monsters, just broken people who'd made terrible choices. But love doesn't excuse betrayal. I clutched the deed in my mind's eye, its weight anchoring me. This fight was only beginning, and I was ready. The deposition was scheduled for a Monday, and I spent the weekend preparing with Sarah. Her office became my war room, littered with coffee cups and legal pads. She coached me on what to expect. Pinnacle's lawyers would try to paint me as negligent, someone who'd let her parents manage her affairs. They'll twist the narrative, she said. Stay calm. Stick to the truth. I nodded, but my stomach churned. The truth was simple. I trusted my parents, and they'd betrayed me. The morning of the deposition, I dressed carefully. Black blazer, white blouse, hair pulled back. I wanted to look like someone who couldn't be broken. The law firm's conference room was sterile, all glass and steel, with Pinnacle's lawyer, a slick man named Grayson, smirking across the table. My parents sat at the far end, my mother fidgeting with her necklace, my father staring at his hands. They looked small, diminished, like strangers. Grayson started with me, his questions sharp. Ms. Harper, did you ever give your parents access to your financial documents? I met his gaze. No. I kept everything separate, especially the deed. He pressed harder, implying I'd been careless. But I didn't waver. The deed was my shield, and I wielded it with every answer. Then it was my parents' turn. Watching them squirm under oath was surreal. My mother's voice trembled as she admitted to signing my name, claiming it was for the family. My father was worse, mumbling about debts and desperation, unable to meet my eyes. Their story fell apart when Sarah presented the real deed, its notarized seal gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Grayson's smirk faded. After the deposition, Sarah pulled me aside. That went better than expected. Their case is weak, and the police are building a strong fraud case. I nodded, but my heart was heavy. Seeing my parents unravel hadn't felt like victory, it felt like loss. I drove home in silence, the city blurring past. I wanted my apartment back, but I also wanted the family I'd never really had. The next blow came from Pinnacle. They offered a settlement, $500,000 to walk away. It was tempting, half the apartment's value, enough to start over. But it wasn't just about money. It was about principle, about holding people accountable. I told Sarah to reject it. We're going to trial, I said, surprising myself with my own resolve. That night, my mother showed up at my rental, unannounced. She stood in the doorway, her coat damp from the rain, her eyes red. Ellie, I'm sorry, she whispered. We thought we were saving ourselves. I wanted to slam the door, but I let her in. She sat on my sagging couch, twisting her hands. We didn't think you'd fight back. That's the problem, I said, my voice low. You thought I'd just take it like always. She cried, but I didn't comfort her. Couldn't. Not yet. The trial date was set for 3 months out, giving us time to build our case. Sarah dug into Pinnacle's history, uncovering a pattern of shady deals. They'd bought other properties under questionable circumstances, banking on owners who wouldn't fight. But I wasn't like those owners. I had the deed, and I had a fire in me that wouldn't die. I started visiting my apartment, or what was left of it. Pinnacle had begun renovations, ripping out the hardwood floors I'd loved. Seeing the destruction hurt, but it also fueled me. I took photos, documented every change, and sent them to Sarah. This was evidence, proof of their arrogance in thinking they'd won. At work, Lila noticed my focus shift. "You're different," she said one slow afternoon. "Stronger." I smiled, surprised. Maybe I was. The fight was changing me, stripping away the daughter who'd always said yes. I was learning to say no, to stand up, to claim what was mine. By the end of the month, the police had enough to charge my parents with fraud and forgery. The news hit me harder than I expected. They weren't just my betrayers, they were my family, and now they faced prison. I lay awake that night, torn between justice and guilt. But the deed, still in my safe deposit box, reminded me why I was fighting. This wasn't just about them, it was about me and the life I deserved. The weeks before the trial were a grind. Sarah and I met daily, piecing together evidence like a puzzle. The notary who'd helped my parents was cooperating with the police, her testimony a nail in their coffin. Pinnacle's lawyers, meanwhile, were doubling down, painting me as a vindictive daughter out to ruin her parents. It was a low blow, but I'd expected it. They didn't know me. Not the real me, the one who'd clawed her way out of their shadow. I started getting calls from relatives, aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to in years. "Ellie, they're your parents." My Aunt Linda pleaded over the phone. "Can't you let this go?" I wanted to scream. Let it go? They'd stolen my home, my future. But I stayed calm, explaining the truth until my voice grew hoarse. Most didn't get it, they saw family loyalty as a chain, not a choice. At the coffee shop, I threw myself into work, needing the routine to stay grounded. Lila promoted me to shift manager, a small win that felt huge. "You've got grit," she said, handing me the new badge. I smiled, but inside, I was bracing for the trial. It wasn't just about the apartment anymore. It was about proving I wasn't the pushover they thought. The trial began on a cold February morning, the courtroom packed with reporters sniffing out a juicy family drama. I sat beside Sarah, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. My parents were across the room, looking older, frilier, their lawyer whispering in their ears. Pinnacle's team was there too, Grayson leading the charge with his polished arrogance. Sarah's opening statement was a masterclass, laying out the fraud with surgical precision. The forged signature, the shady notary, the rushed sale. She held up the real deed, its seal catching the light, and I saw jurors lean forward. Grayson countered, claiming Pinnacle was an innocent buyer, but his argument crumbled when Sarah presented the notary's testimony. The room felt electric, the truth cutting through their lies. When I took the stand, my heart pounded, but my voice was steady. I told my story. The years of bailing out my parents, the apartment as my lifeline, the betrayal that broke me. Grayson cross-examined, trying to trip me up, but I didn't falter. "I trusted them," I said, looking at the jury, "and they used that trust to steal from me." My mother's sob echoed in the silence. My parents' testimony was a disaster. My mother cried, admitting to the forgery but claiming it was for the family. My father was worse, his excuses rambling and weak. The jury's faces hardened, and I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. They'd done this to themselves, but it still hurt to watch. Pinnacle's defense hinged on their good faith purchase, but Sarah shredded it, showing their history of exploiting loopholes. By the end of the first week, the tide was turning. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, seemed unimpressed by Grayson's theatrics. I left the courtroom each day exhausted but hopeful, the deed's weight in my mind keeping me steady. Outside the trial, life kept moving. I started therapy, something I'd resisted for years. Talking about my parents, their betrayal was like peeling back layers of scar tissue. My therapist, Dr. Chun, helped me see that my anger wasn't just about the apartment. It was about a lifetime of being their safety net. I was learning to let go not of the fight, but of the guilt. One night, I visited the apartment again. Pinnacle had stopped renovations, the place frozen in chaos. Exposed beams, torn up floors. I stood in the empty living room, imagining it whole again. This was my home, and I'd fight to the end for it. As I left, I saw a neighbor, Mrs. Ortiz, who'd known me since I moved in. "You're doing the right thing," she said, her hand on my arm. Her words stayed with me, a reminder that I wasn't alone. By the trial's second week, the evidence was overwhelming. The notary's testimony, the deed, the paper trail, it all pointed to fraud. I felt the momentum building, but I also felt the weight of what came next. Winning meant consequences not just for Pinnacle, but for my parents. I wasn't sure I was ready for that, but I was ready to fight. The trial's second week was brutal. Pinnacle's lawyers shifted tactics, painting my parents as victims of circumstance, desperate people who'd made a mistake. It was a clever move, appealing to the jury's sympathy, but Sarah was relentless. She called witnesses, neighbors who'd seen my parents visit the apartment, a bank teller who'd flagged suspicious activity on their account. Each piece tightened the noose around their defense. I sat in the courtroom, watching my parents unravel. My mother's tears had dried up, replaced by a hollow stare. My father looked defeated, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his choices. I wanted to feel vindicated, but all I felt was a dull ache. They weren't masterminds, just people who'd gambled with my life and lost. Grayson's cross-examinations grew nastier, implying I'd known about the sale and done nothing. Sarah objected, and the judge shut him down, but the accusations stung. I wasn't perfect. I trusted too much, stayed silent too long, but I wasn't the villain here. The deed, still locked away, was my proof, my anchor in the storm. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy grew. A local paper ran a headline, "Daughter sues parents over stolen home." Strangers stared at me in the coffee shop, whispering. Lila told me to take a few days off, but I refused. Work was my refuge, the one place where I could still feel normal. I poured lattes, smiled at customers, and pretended my world wasn't on fire. One night, Sarah called with news. Pinnacle was offering a new settlement, $1 million, plus legal fees. It was more than the apartment's value, a tempting escape from the trial's grind. "They're scared," Sarah said. "They know they're losing." I thought about it, staring at the deed on my table. The money could buy a new place, a fresh start, but it wouldn't erase the betrayal or restore what I'd lost. "No," I said. "We finished this." The trial's turning point came when Sarah called an expert in property law. He testified that Pinnacle's due diligence was non-existent. They'd ignored red flags, like the rushed sale and low price. The jury's faces shifted, their skepticism turning toward the developer. Grayson's polished facade cracked, his questions growing frantic. I saw hope in Sarah's eyes, and for the first time, I believed we'd win. My parents' lawyer tried a last-ditch plea, asking for leniency. "They're not criminals," he said. "They're a family in crisis." The words hit hard, stirring memories of better days. Christmas mornings, my dad teaching me to cook, my mom's rare laughter. But those memories couldn't erase the truth. They'd chosen themselves over me, again and again. After the trial adjourned for the day, I went to therapy. Dr. Chun asked how I felt about my parents facing prison. I didn't have an answer. Part of me wanted them punished, but another part wanted them to understand, to change. "You can't fix them," Dr. Chun said gently. "You can only protect yourself." Her words stayed with me, a quiet truth I was starting to accept. I visited the apartment again, standing in the gutted living room. The bay window was still there, its glass smudged but whole. I pressed my hand against it, imagining the life I'd rebuild. Mrs. Ortiz stopped by, bringing me a coffee. "You're strong, Ellie," she said. "Stronger than they ever gave you credit for." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. She was right, I was stronger and I was done apologizing for it. As the trial neared its end, the police updated me. My parents had confessed to the forgery, hoping for a lighter sentence. The news should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. It was just another piece of the mess they'd made. I went home, the deed still my talisman, and prepared for the final days of the fight. I wasn't just fighting for my apartment. I was fighting for myself, for the woman I was becoming. The trial's final days were a blur of tension and hope. Sarah presented our closing arguments, her voice steady as she recounted the fraud, the betrayal, the undeniable truth of the deed. Ellie Harper trusted her parents, she told the jury, and they exploited that trust for their own gain. I watched the jurors, their faces a mix of sympathy and resolve. They saw me, not the daughter but the woman fighting for justice. Pinnacle's closing was all bluster, Grayson insisting they'd acted in good faith. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forged signature, the notary's testimony, Pinnacle's shady history. The judge's instructions to the jury were clear. Focus on the facts, not the emotions. I held my breath as they filed out to deliberate, my parents' eyes on me for the first time in days. I looked away. Deliberation took 2 days, the longest of my life. I stayed with Lila, who let me crash on her couch, feeding me takeout and bad reality TV to keep my mind off the weight. "You've got this," she said, squeezing my hand. I wanted to believe her, but fear gnawed at me. What if the jury sided with Pinnacle? What if my parents walked free, leaving me with nothing? The verdict came on a snowy afternoon. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood. "We find for the plaintiff, Ellie Harper," she said. "The sale of the property is null and void. Pinnacle Properties is ordered to return the apartment and pay damages of $1.2 million. My heart leapt, relief flooding me. Sarah grabbed my hand, her smile triumphant. On the fraud charges, the jury found my parents guilty. The judge set sentencing for a month later, but the weight of it hit me immediately. They'd face up to 3 years each, maybe less with good behavior. I should have felt victorious, but all I felt was exhaustion. I'd won my home, but I'd lost my family. After the verdict, reporters swarmed me outside the courthouse. I gave a brief statement, thanking Sarah and the jury, then slipped away. I didn't want the spotlight, I wanted my life back. That night, I went to the apartment, now legally mine again. It was still a mess, but it was mine. I stood in the living room, the deed in my hands, and cried for the first time in weeks. Not just for the win, but for everything I'd lost to get here. Sarah called the next day with more good news. Pinnacle was under investigation for other fraudulent deals. My case had sparked a bigger fight, one that might take them down for good. I felt a flicker of pride. I'd stood up, not just for me, but for others they tried to scam. My parents' sentencing loomed, and I wrestled with whether to attend. Dr. Chun urged me to go, to face them one last time. "Closure isn't about them," she said. "It's about you." I wasn't sure I was ready, but I knew she was right. I needed to see this through, not for them, but for the woman I was becoming. I started planning the apartment's restoration, sketching ideas for new floors, fresh paint. Mrs. Ortiz offered to help, rallying neighbors to pitch in. Their support reminded me I wasn't alone. That family wasn't just blood. It was the people who showed up. I went back to work, my new manager role giving me purpose. Lila joked that I was her best hire, and I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in months. The night before sentencing, I sat with the deed, its edges worn from my touch. I thought about my parents, about the love we'd once had, now buried under their choices. I didn't hate them, but I couldn't forgive them, not yet. This wasn't the end of my story, but it was the end of theirs in mine. I was ready to move forward, to rebuild, to claim the life I'd fought for. The sentencing hearing was quieter than the trial, the courtroom half empty. I sat in the back, my hands clasped tightly, the deed safe in my bag. My parents stood before the judge, their faces gaunt. My mother's eyes searched for me, but I stayed still, invisible in my grief. The judge was firm but fair. 2 years for each, with parole possible in one. They'd lose their freedom just as they'd tried to take mine. As they were led away, my father turned, his voice breaking. "Ellie, we're sorry." I nodded, but didn't speak. Words wouldn't fix this. I left the courthouse, the snow crunching under my boots, and drove to the apartment. It was time to rebuild. Restoration began the next week. I hired contractors, using part of the damages to fund it. Mrs. Ortiz and the neighbors helped, painting walls and hauling debris. The apartment slowly came back to life. New hardwood floors, a fresh coat of cream paint, the bay window polished until it gleamed. Each change felt like a step toward healing, a reclaiming of my space. I moved back in 3 months later, the apartment whole again. I hung curtains, set up my books, and sat by the window with a coffee, watching the city hum. This was home, not just a place, but a testament to my strength. I'd fought and won, not just against my parents and Pinnacle, but against the part of me that had always bent to their will. Therapy continued, helping me untangle the guilt and anger. Dr. Chun pushed me to write a letter to my parents, not to send, but to release. I poured out everything. The hurt, the love, the boundaries I'd set. I burned it afterward, the ashes scattering in the wind. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was freedom. Work became a joy again. Lila and I planned to open a second coffee shop, and she made me a partner. "You've earned it," she said, and I believed her. I was building something new, something mine, just like the apartment. My neighbors became my family, their support a constant warmth. Mrs. Ortiz brought me plants, joking that I needed life in the place. I laughed, feeling whole. I didn't hear from my parents, and I didn't reach out. The silence was painful but necessary. I'd spent my life carrying their weight, and now I was light, unburdened. The deed stayed in my safe deposit box, a reminder of what I'd fought for, what I'd won. One evening, I sat in my living room, the city lights sparkling outside. I thought about the girl I'd been, always fixing, always forgiving. She was still part of me, but she wasn't all of me. I was Ellie Harper, strong, flawed, free. The apartment was more than walls and windows. It was proof I could stand up, fight back, and build a life on my terms. As I looked out at Brooklyn, I felt peace. The fight had cost me, but it had given me something greater, myself. I'd lost my parents, but I'd found my strength, my home, my future, and that was enough.